The moment Catherine Collins walked into the dusty town of Redemption, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she made one thing perfectly clear to every man who dared tip his hat in her direction. She was not a woman who would be owned. She had come from St. Louis with a carpetbag in one hand and a leather satchel full of surveying tools in the other, her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that she had purchased specifically, because the shopkeeper had told her it was a man's hat, and she had told him that was precisely why she wanted it. She was 26 years old, sharp-eyed, and possessed of a mind that could calculate land measurements faster than most men could saddle a horse. She had a certificate from the Missouri School of Land Sciences, a rarity for a woman in any era, and she had fought bitterly for every inch of that education. Her father, God rest him, had believed in her. Her mother had wept quietly and said nothing. The men at her school had laughed loudly and said plenty. None of it had stopped her. Redemption, Texas, was a town in the middle of its own particular crisis. The railroad was coming through, and with the railroad came speculators, and with speculators came disputes about land boundaries that had not been properly recorded when the original settlers had staked their claims back in the 1850s. The county needed a surveyor badly enough that they had advertised as far north as St. Louis, and Catherine had answered that advertisement with a letter so precise and so thorough in its demonstration of competence that the county clerk, a nervous little man named Harold Fitch, had hired her by return mail before he fully understood that he had hired a woman. When she stepped off the stagecoach and Harold Fitch saw her, his face performed a series of expressions that Catherine had grown deeply familiar with over the years. First came confusion, then came the slow rearrangement into something approaching offense, and then came the particular kind of clearing of the throat that meant a man was about to explain something to her that she already knew far better than he did. "Miss Collins," Harold said, holding the letter she had sent him as though it might have changed its contents since he last read it. "I had assumed you were a mister." "I am a miss," Catherine said pleasantly. The advertisement said the county needed someone who could survey disputed land boundaries, produce accurate maps, and testify in court as to their findings. "I can do all three of those things. Can your next candidate?" Harold Fitch opened his mouth, closed it, and looked around the street as though help might materialize from the general direction of the saloon. It did not materialize. What materialized instead was a tall man leading a bay horse by the reins, who had clearly just ridden hard because both the man and the horse were coated in a fine layer of red Texas dust. He stopped a few feet away because a stagecoach and a standoff were occupying the road he needed to cross, and he stood there with the easy patience of someone who had learned that most things in life resolved themselves if you gave them enough time and quiet. Catherine noticed him the way she noticed most things, thoroughly and without making a show of it. He was perhaps 29 or 30, broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual labor rather than vanity, with a face that was weathered enough to look honest and not so weathered as to look careless. He wore a battered hat, a clean shirt that had seen better days, and boots that had clearly been resoled at least twice. He was watching the exchange between her and Harold Fitch with an expression of mild interest and what she might have described, if pressed, as quiet amusement. "Mr. Fitch," Catherine said, returning her attention to the county clerk, "I have ridden for 3 days on a stagecoach to get here. I have my credentials, I have my instruments, and I have a contract that you signed and mailed back to me. Unless you intend to tell me that your signature is worthless, I suggest we move forward." Harold Fitch sighed the sigh of a man who could see that the battle was already lost. "Right this way, Miss Collins." The tall man with the bay horse stepped aside to let them pass. As Catherine walked by him, she caught his eye for just a moment, and he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was not condescending, not particularly elaborate, and not accompanied by any of the smirking commentary she had come to expect. It was simply a greeting, one person acknowledging another. She did not think much about it then. She had work to do. Her office was a small room above the land registry, which smelled of old paper and dried ink and suited her perfectly. Harold Fitch had arranged a cot in the corner, which she thanked him for, and a desk by the window, which she thanked him more sincerely for. She unpacked her instruments with the careful reverence of a woman who knew exactly how much each one had cost her, laid out her blank survey maps, and got to work understanding the nature of the disputes she had been hired to resolve. There were three main conflicts. The Pemberton family claimed 20 acres that the Delacroix family claimed had been their grazing land for 20 years. A man named Silas Greer was asserting that the eastern boundary of his property extended far enough to cut off road access to 4 smaller homesteads, which would leave those families essentially landlocked. And there was a particularly tangled situation involving a creek that had changed course during a flood 6 years ago, leaving 2 ranches arguing about which of them now owned the most fertile strip of bottomland on its new bank. She was deeply absorbed in the existing land records, such as they were, when someone knocked on her office door the following morning. "Come in," she said, not looking up from the map she was annotating. The door opened, boots on wooden floors. She looked up. It was the man with the bay horse. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that the morning light made interesting, and that the amusement she had noticed the day before was a settled feature of his face rather than a response to any particular situation. He held his hat in both hands, which she noted because men who held their hats when they entered a room usually did so because they had been raised to show respect indoors, and that was worth noticing. "Morning," he said. "You're Miss Collins, the new surveyor." "I am," she confirmed. "Graham Malone." He did not say anything else immediately, just offered the name the way you offered a handshake, plainly and without decoration. "Mr. Malone," she said, "what can I do for you?" He pulled up the one spare chair without being invited, but did it in a way that somehow did not feel presumptuous, and sat down as though he had been sitting in dusty rooms talking business with women surveyors all his life. "I've got land in the creek dispute," he said. "The bottomland on the north bank. 6 years ago that creek jumped its channel, and now half of what I'd been farming for 3 years is technically on the wrong side of where the original survey said the boundary was. The Malone claim," she said, finding the relevant papers. "You're arguing that the creek's natural shift should count as a change in boundary. I'm arguing that I broke that ground, I planted it, and I've been working it," he said. "But I also know that isn't how property law works, which is why I'm here talking to you instead of to the other fella's face." She looked at him with fresh attention. In her experience, men in land disputes were rarely this candid about the limits of their own legal position. It usually took considerably longer for them to arrive at the acknowledgement that wanting something and being legally entitled to it were 2 separate questions. "The other party is Mr. Harlan Voss," she said. "It is," Graham confirmed without any particular heat. "I'll need to walk the land," she said. "Both sides of the current creek line, and I want to see the original survey stakes if any remain. 2 of them are still in the ground," he said. "I left them alone on purpose. Figured they'd matter." She made a note. "That was sensible." "I have my moments," he said. She almost smiled. She did not quite because she was working, but it was closer than she generally got in an office context. "I'll arrange to survey the Voss land first," she said, "since it would be improper to start with your property and have you present while I'm forming my initial assessments. I'll come to your place after." "That's fair," he said simply, and stood and put his hat back on his head. He was almost to the door when he stopped and turned back, and she would think about that pause later, the way he considered before he spoke. "For what it's worth," he said, "Harold Fitch was talking last night about whether the county had made an error in who they hired. I thought you should know because it seemed like something you'd want to know." She met his gaze steadily. "Thank you," she said, "and for what it is worth back, I intend to do my job so well that Mr. Fitch's doubt becomes a permanent inconvenience to him." Graham Malone smiled then, and it was a good smile, uncomplicated and genuine. "I believe you," he said and left. She sat for a moment after the door closed, listening to his boots on the stairs, and then she picked up her pen and went back to work. The following days were filled with the particular business of surveying, which looked to most observers like a woman walking slowly across fields and meadows with a theodolite and a measuring chain, making notations in a small leather book. To Catherine, it was far more than that. It was reading the land's own history, the way old fence posts told you where someone had first believed a boundary to be, the way the earth changed color where a creek had once run, the way the trees grew differently in soil that had been turned versus soil that had never been broken. She surveyed the Voss property on a Tuesday, with Harlan Voss himself trailing behind her at a careful distance, offering opinions that she acknowledged politely and factored in not at all. Voss was a heavy man with expensive boots and the particular brand of confidence that came from having more money than his neighbors. He had hired a lawyer from San Antonio who had ridden up to observe, a thin man in a dark suit who wrote everything down in a notebook. "The original eastern boundary of the Voss claim," Catherine said, on her knees in the mud at the creek bank, examining a weathered wooden stake, "was established when this creek ran approximately 14 feet to the west of its current channel." The lawyer wrote this down. Voss watched her with an expression that suggested he was waiting for her to say something that suited him. She did not say anything that suited him. She measured and notated and moved on. She came to Graham Malone's property on Wednesday morning, arriving before the heat of the day because she had learned in her first full week in Texas that the heat of the day was not something to be casual about. His ranch was a modest operation, a house that was clearly built by someone who knew carpentry and cared about doing it right, a barn that was practical and in good repair, fields that showed the kind of consistent, careful working that came from someone who treated the land as a relationship rather than a resource. He was already out when she arrived, and he met her at the fence line without making her wait. He had 2 horses ready, his bay and a calm chestnut mare he offered her without comment, and she accepted the horse without comment, because they were going to cover a lot of ground and walking it would take 3 times as long. They rode to the original survey stakes first, and she dismounted and examined them with the focused attention she gave to everything. Graham stood to the side, quiet in the way of someone who understood that being useful sometimes meant not interrupting. She appreciated that more than she could have easily explained. "Tell me about the flood," she said, not looking up from her measurements. He told her. 6 years ago, a 3-day rain had swelled the creek until it found a new path through a low point in the bank on the north side, cutting itself a new channel and leaving the old one to dry up slowly into a grass-covered depression. He described it without drama, the way men who lived with weather tended to describe weather as a fact rather than a catastrophe. "And you had already broken this ground by then," she said. 2 full growing seasons," he confirmed. "Wheat first year, corn the second. I was planning to do a rotation." She made her notes. They moved along the creek bank in the warm morning, and she measured, and he answered her questions when she had them, and the silence between questions was companionable in a way that surprised her. She had spent most of her professional life either justifying her presence or managing the discomfort of others, and the absence of either obligation was unusual enough to notice. At a point where the old creek bed was clearly visible as a shallow depression in the grass, she stopped and looked at both lines simultaneously, the old boundary and the new reality of the land. "The law," she said, "generally holds that when a watercourse changes its channel through a sudden event rather than a gradual shift, the property boundaries do not move with it. The original surveyed line remains the legal boundary." "I figured as much," Graham said. "That means the North Bank bottomland, where the creek now actually runs, is legally still within the Voss boundary as it was originally drawn." He nodded slowly. He did not argue, did not look for a loophole in what she had said, did not try to suggest she was wrong. He absorbed it with the steady acceptance of someone who had asked for truth and received it. However, Catherine said, and she said it not because she was trying to give him hope he had not earned, but because the land itself told a different story in specific places. The original survey of the Voss property has an error in it, approximately here. She pointed to a spot on her emerging map. The stake placement was incorrect by about 30 feet when it was originally set, likely because the surveyor in 1852 was using a compass that was affected by mineral deposits in this particular section of ground. I've been testing the soil and I can identify the anomaly clearly. Graham looked at her. What does that mean? It means that the strip of bottomland you have been farming, the specific 12-acre section nearest to your original fence line, falls outside the corrected Voss boundary. Legally, it was never Voss's land to begin with. You've been farming land that, by the corrected survey, is public domain land adjacent to your own claim, which gives you a strong argument for a homestead filing on those 12 acres specifically. There was a silence. She watched him process this, not the triumphant way a man who expected to win processed unexpected good news, but the careful way of someone making sure they understood correctly. You found an error in the original survey, he said. I find them fairly often, she said. The original surveys out here were done quickly and under difficult conditions. I am not saying the 1852 surveyor was incompetent. I'm saying that instruments in 1852 had limitations, and this particular stretch of ground has specific magnetic characteristics that would have affected his readings. So the 12 acres I've been working the longest, he said slowly, were never legally Harlan Voss's, she said. I will document this fully in my report. You should speak to a land attorney about filing a homestead claim on those specific acres. The Voss claim to the remaining bottomland on the New Creek bank will likely stand, but those 12 acres are a separate question entirely. Graham Malone looked out at the land, at the fields he had been working, at the creek glinting in the morning light. He looked at it the way a man looked at something he had put years of himself into, and Catherine, who had spent her career keeping professional distance from the emotional weight of what land meant to people, found herself standing in that particular morning and feeling the weight of it alongside him. I appreciate you telling me straight, he said, not wrapping it up to soften it. I don't tend to soften things, she said. I noticed, he said, and there was that smile again. They rode back toward the ranch house, and he offered her water and coffee, and she accepted both, and they sat on the porch in the particular shade of a Texas morning before the heat became serious. He brought out a plate of biscuits that were clearly not his first attempt at making them, and she ate two without any particular commentary because they were good and there was no reason not to say so. You're not from Texas, he said. St. Louis, she confirmed. You're not from here either. He raised an eyebrow slightly. What makes you say that? Your R sounds, she said. And the way you said creek earlier. You grew up somewhere with harder winters, Ohio maybe, or Indiana. He looked at her with open appreciation of this observation. Ohio, he said, came west when I was 19, figured the land was cheaper and the opportunities were bigger. Were they? The land was definitely cheaper, he said. The opportunities required more work than the pamphlets suggested. She laughed, a short, genuine laugh that she rarely produced in professional contexts, and he looked at her as though the sound had pleased him. She caught herself noticing that she had laughed, and then caught herself noticing that she had noticed, and made a small internal note to pay attention to what she was doing. She finished her coffee, thanked him for the hospitality, and rode back to town with her notebook full of measurements, and the particular sensation in her chest that she had learned over the years to treat with caution. Catherine Collins had been focused on her career and her independence for so long that the feeling of finding a person interesting in that specific way was as unfamiliar as it was inconvenient. She had work to do. The Silas Greer situation proved to be the more immediately urgent problem. Silas Greer was a man in his 50s who had done well enough in the years after the war to acquire land and the attitude that came with too much of it too fast. The 4 homesteader families he was threatening to landlock were all smaller operations. One of them, a widow named Mrs. Annabel Torres, who had been working her 60 acres with her 3 sons, and a determination that Catherine deeply respected. When Catherine visited the Torres property to survey the road access question, Mrs. Torres met her with the particular wariness of someone who had been on the wrong end of official decisions before. She was a woman of around 50, with dark eyes and weathered hands, and the kind of dignity that came not from wealth, but from the consistent choice to hold your head up regardless of what the world was doing to it. "Mr. Greer has a lawyer," Mrs. Torres said, watching Catherine set up her theodolite. "He does," Catherine confirmed. "We do not." "That is a disadvantage in court," Catherine said honestly, "but it is not a disadvantage to me in my survey work. I measure what is there. I document what is true. Whatever I find applies equally regardless of who can afford representation." Mrs. Torres studied her for a long moment. "They said a woman was doing the surveys," she said. "They said correctly," Catherine agreed. "Good," Mrs. Torres said, with a finality that suggested she had reached a conclusion Catherine had not entirely followed, but which seemed favorable. "I'll have my boys hold your measuring chain if you need them." The road access situation, as Catherine worked through it over 2 days, turned out to be relatively clear. The original land grant to the Greer property had explicitly preserved a road easement along its eastern edge to allow access for the homesteaders behind it. This easement had been documented in the original filing and had simply never been properly acknowledged in subsequent transactions. Silas Greer either had not known about it or had counted on no one looking carefully enough to find it. Catherine found it on a Thursday afternoon. In the county records that Harold Fitch kept in a state of cheerful organizational chaos that she had spent parts of 2 evenings beginning to systematize. It was right there in the original grant language, 64 words that protected 4 families' access to the main road forever. She wrote it up that same evening. When she delivered her preliminary findings to Harold Fitch the next morning and watched his face cycle through surprise and then reluctant respect, she felt the particular satisfaction that came from knowing she had done her job well and that it had mattered to real people's lives. "The Greer matter should resolve fairly cleanly in the homesteader's favor," she said. "I'd recommend you have the county attorney contact Mr. Greer's lawyer before this goes to a hearing. There is no ambiguity in the easement documentation." Harold studied her preliminary report for longer than it probably required. "This is thorough work," he said, in the tone of a man being forced to acknowledge something he had not wanted to be true. "Yes," she agreed pleasantly. "It generally is." She was walking back to her office when she nearly collided with Graham Malone on the steps of the Land Registry building. He caught her by the shoulders to stop her from stumbling back, an immediate reflexive courtesy, and then removed his hands the moment she had her balance, which she also noted. "Miss Collins," he said, "just the person I was hoping to see." "Mr. Malone," she said, "I was going to send word. My report on the creek boundary is nearly complete. You should speak to Attorney Richards about that homestead filing." "That's not actually what I wanted to see you about," he said. She waited. "There's going to be a social at the church this Saturday," he said. "The Methodists run one every month or so. Most of the town goes. I wondered if you'd care to attend with me." She looked at him carefully. He was not fidgeting, not avoiding her gaze, not doing any of the things men tended to do when they were asking something they expected to be refused. He was just standing there, direct and uncomplicated, waiting for her answer. "Are you asking me to accompany you as a social courtesy to a newcomer?" she said slowly. "Or are you asking me in a different capacity?" "The second one," he said. She had 2 competing instincts about this. The first was the deeply established instinct that said a relationship would complicate her professional position in this town, and that the professional position was why she was here and what she had worked for and what mattered. The second was the newer instinct, born of biscuits on a porch, and a man who had absorbed bad legal news without trying to shoot the messenger, that said this particular person might be worth some complication. "I'll think about it," she said, which was more than she had intended to say. "That's a better answer than I expected," he said honestly. She went upstairs to her office. She thought about it with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to survey work for approximately 20 minutes. At the end of those 20 minutes she came downstairs again and found him still in the vicinity of the land registry steps, talking to Harold Fitch about something that apparently required very little of his actual attention because he saw her immediately when she emerged. "Yes," she said. "Saturday," he confirmed and smiled. The church social was held in the Methodist Church's meeting hall, which smelled of wood polish and the particular floral arrangements that indicated a group of women who took their decorating seriously. Half the town appeared to be there, and Catherine was aware from the moment she arrived with Graham Malone that she was being observed with the kind of community interest that small towns specialized in. She did not particularly enjoy being observed, but she had been dealing with it her entire professional life and had developed the ability to simply not let it alter her behavior. Graham stayed beside her without hovering, brought her a cup of lemonade without being asked, and introduced her to the people who came over to meet her with a matter-of-fact straightforwardness that she found herself grateful for. He did not introduce her as the lady surveyor, or the new woman in town, or any of the other framings she had heard used when people were not entirely sure what to do with her existence. He introduced her as Catherine Collins, the county surveyor, which was simply accurate. She met Mrs. Annabel Torres again, who had come with her eldest son, a serious young man of about 20 named Raphael, and who greeted Catherine with a warmth that made several of the bystanders look mildly surprised. She met the Pemberton family, who were part of the other boundary dispute, and who were polite to her in the careful way of people who knew she held something important in her hands and were not entirely sure what she would do with it. She met the pastor and his wife, who were genuinely welcoming in a way that did not seem to be about anything other than the fact that she was a person who had come to their gathering. And she talked with Graham, in the way that you talked at a social event when the social event was not entirely the point, where the actual conversation was happening in the spaces between the official conversation. He told her more about coming west, about the years of working other men's ranches before he had saved enough to stake his own claim, about the specific way this particular piece of Texas land had looked when he had first ridden out on it, and known it was where he intended to stay. She found herself telling him about Missouri, about her father who had been an engineer and who had taught her to read surveying maps before she could read novels, about the professor at the Missouri School of Land Sciences who had told her she would never work in the field because clients would not accept her, and about the very first client who had and what that had meant to her. "How long did you have to fight before someone actually hired you?" he asked. 3 years, she said, "after I graduated. I did every piece of drafting and office work they'd give me at 3 different survey companies. I made myself indispensable, and then I made the business case that sending me into the field cost them less than sending a full male team because I worked alone and produced faster. That seems like a lot of extra work just to get to the starting point," he said. "It is," she said, "but no one was going to hand me the starting point." He was quiet for a moment, in that particular way of someone who was genuinely absorbing what you had said rather than formulating his next comment. "I grew up with a sister who was smarter than most men I knew," he said. "She wanted to be a physician. She ended up marrying a merchant and keeping his books. Not because she chose to, but because there wasn't a path that let her choose otherwise." "I'm sorry," Catherine said, and meant it. "She's happy enough," he said. "But I always thought it was a waste, not of her life. She made something real out of what she had, a waste of what she could have been if the world had been built differently." Catherine looked at him in the warm lamplight of the church hall, at this man who had just said something she had thought many times in many forms and never heard anyone else say, and she felt the complication she had anticipated arriving with a decisiveness that made careful professional distance feel considerably less convincing. They walked back through town together after the social ended, not because it was a particular plan, but because they both seemed to be going in the same direction and neither made any move to change that. The Texas night was warm and enormous, the sky so thick with stars that it seemed extravagant, and the town was quiet at this hour with just the distant noise of the saloon at the far end of the main street. "Can I ask you something?" Graham said, as they reached the land registry building. "You can ask," she said. "What would it take," he said carefully, "for you to consider something beyond a professional acquaintance?" She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had asked the question directly instead of circling around it for months, who had stated his interest plainly, and was now waiting just as plainly for her honest answer. "I've been asked that before," she said. "Usually what the man asking it had in mind was that I would keep doing my work until we married, and then I'd be expected to stop, because a man doesn't want his wife out doing field surveys alone in all weathers. I have no interest in that arrangement." "That seems like a waste of your training and your skills," Graham said. "It is," she said, "and more than that, it's a waste of who I am. My work isn't something I do until the real part of my life starts. It is a real part of my life." "I understand that," he said. "I'll only be seriously interested," she said, and she said it looking straight at him because she was not going to soften it or make it easier to dismiss, "in a man who treats me as an equal, who understands that my opinions and my judgment and my right to make decisions about my own life are equal to his. Not a man who says that and means it only when it's convenient, a man who actually means it." Graham Malone looked at her steadily. He did not look surprised or challenged or defensive. He did not look like a man who needed to think about whether that was something he could offer. He looked like a man who had already known, from some point before this specific conversation, what his answer to this specific question would be. "Done," he said. The word was simple and complete and utterly without reservation, and Catherine Collins, who had been careful for so long about not letting herself be moved by words alone, felt something in her chest shift in a way that was neither small nor easily dismissed. "We'll see," she said, because she was still Catherine Collins, and Catherine Collins tested things rather than taking them on faith. "Fair enough," he said. "I wouldn't want you to take my word for it." She went upstairs. She did not immediately return to her survey notes, which was unusual for her. She sat at her desk for several minutes looking at the lamp flame and letting herself feel, without analysis, the specific quality of the evening she had just had. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. The following weeks had a rhythm to them that she had not expected. The work moved forward steadily. She completed the Malone Creek survey. The Greer easement report moved toward formal resolution, and she began the more complex work of the Pemberton-Delacroix boundary dispute, which required her to establish where a fence line had stood before it was partially torn down in a disagreement 4 years ago. And Graham Malone came by her office 2 or 3 times a week, never in a way that interrupted her work, always with a clear reason that was not entirely the real reason. He brought news about the legal proceedings on the Creek case. He brought information about the Pemberton fence that he had heard secondhand from a neighbor who had been present at the original installation. He brought coffee once, from the diner down the street, in the particular efficient way of someone who had noticed that she frequently forgot to eat or drink when she was absorbed in her maps. Each time she found herself tracking the progress of these visits not as interruptions, but as punctuation in her days. He kept his word. That was what she was watching for, and it was what she found. When she gave him her opinion about something, he listened to it as you listened to the opinion of someone whose judgment you respected. When she disagreed with him, which happened on at least 2 occasions involving the town's political alignments, and once on a question about the best approach to dryland soil in this particular region, he engaged with her disagreement on its actual merits rather than becoming defensive or dismissive. Once she convinced him she was right, and he said so without any particular difficulty. Once he made an argument that convinced her that she had been looking at a piece of information incorrectly, and she acknowledged that with the same directness. He was not performing equality. He simply practiced it, the way you practice something that had become part of how you moved through the world. The Pemberton-Delacroix dispute was the most difficult of the three, because it required her to make a finding that neither family entirely wanted. The fence line she established from the physical evidence of old post holes and the testimony of 3 independent witnesses whose accounts she corroborated through her survey work, had originally stood 4 feet east of where the Delacroix family believed it had stood. This meant that the Pembertons had been correct about a strip of approximately 3 acres. However, she also found that the Pembertons, in the course of the dispute, had dismantled a section of drainage ditch that had historically directed water away from the Delacroix winter field, and that the resulting waterlogging of that field over the past 4 years had caused agricultural damage that was quantifiable. She wrote up both findings with equal precision and let the county attorney work out the equitable resolution that involved the Pembertons acknowledging the boundary and the Delacroix family acknowledging the right to rebuild the drainage. It was not a perfect resolution, and neither family was entirely happy with it, but it was honest, and it was accurate, and it held. Harold Fitch, reading her complete report, was quiet for a very long time. "This is excellent work," he finally said, in the tone of a man who had not expected to say that and was not entirely pleased about having to. "Thank you, Mr. Fitch," she said. "I owe you an apology," he said further, looking pained, "for my initial response when you arrived." "You do," she agreed. "But since you're giving it, I'll accept it." He blinked. He had possibly expected more graciousness about this, but Catherine had found over the years that gracious acceptance of apologies for things that should not have happened in the first place had a way of suggesting the offense had not been particularly serious, which it had been. She let him know she accepted the apology, and she let him feel, briefly, the appropriate weight of having had to give it, and then they moved on. It was a Thursday afternoon in late May when the incident occurred that would later be the thing she remembered, as the moment she stopped testing and started trusting. She had ridden out to the east of town to complete a final measurement on the Greer easement, a straightforward task she had done many times, when the horse she had borrowed from the livery caught a hole in the ground wrong and stumbled. She was not unseated. She was an experienced enough rider for that, but the horse came up lame, and she was 4 miles out of town on a road that saw perhaps 1 traveler every 2 hours on a slow day. She assessed the situation with the practical calm she applied to most problems. The horse could not carry her weight with the injury. She could lead the horse back at walking pace, which would take the better part of 2 hours and would require leaving most of her equipment stacked by the road, which she was disinclined to do since her theodolite was expensive and irreplaceable. Or she could wait and hope someone came by soon. She was unloading her equipment to begin the walk when she heard hoofbeats from the direction of town and looked up to see Graham Malone on his bay horse coming at a comfortable canter that shifted to a trot when he saw her and then to a walk as he pulled up beside her. She stared at him. "How did you know I was here?" she said. "I didn't," he said. "I'm heading out to check my east fence line. I've been seeing some cattle sign that might mean someone's fence is down between here and the Miller Ranch." He had already dismounted and was looking at the livery horse's foreleg with the focused attention of someone who knew what he was looking at. "Not too bad, probably a strain. She'll be fine in a few days, but she's not carrying you home." "I worked that out," Catherine said dryly. He looked up at her. "You want to put your equipment on Cody here and walk alongside, or you want to ride and I'll walk beside you?" she considered. "I'll walk," she said. "I know the way and I am perfectly capable of it, but if you'll take the equipment on your horse, I won't have to leave it." "Done," he said, which was apparently his word for agreement, simple and immediate. They loaded her survey equipment onto the bay horse, who tolerated the unusual cargo with the steady temperament of a well-trained animal, and began the walk back toward town, she leading the lame livery horse and he walking the bay alongside her. It was not romantic in any conventional sense. It was 4 miles on a dusty Texas road in the heat of late May, with a lame horse and a load of surveying instruments, and 2 people walking at the pace that a recovering horse could manage. But the conversation they had over those 2 hours was the most fully herself she could remember being with another person in a very long time. She told him about her mother, who she loved, and who had never fully understood her daughter's choices, but had eventually made a kind of peace with them. She told him about the surveying job in Kansas 2 years ago where a client had refused to pay her because she was a woman, and she had taken him to court and won, and it had been both satisfying and exhausting. She told him about the actual experience of being in the field, the parts she loved that were hard to explain to people who had not felt them, the early mornings when the light was right and the measurements were resolving into a clear picture of how the earth was actually arranged, and it felt like reading the land's own handwriting. He listened the way he always listened, as though what she was saying was worth the space it occupied. He told her about his family in Ohio, about a father who had worked himself to an early death on a farm that provided barely enough, and about the determination he had carried west with him to build something that would not cost that much. He talked about the land, his land, with a love for it that was plain and unashamed, and she understood that love because she felt something similar about her instruments and her maps and the work of making the invisible visible. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked, somewhere around the 2-mile mark. He thought about it honestly. "Some," he said. "The work fills most of the days, but evenings can get quiet in a way that feels different from peaceful." "I know what you mean," she said, which surprised her by being true. They walked the last mile in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was charged with something that neither of them named. When the town came into sight, she felt something that she could only describe as reluctance, which was new. At the livery, he helped her unload her equipment without making it a production. She thanked him, he nodded, and then as she was about to pick up her satchel and head to her office, he said, "Have dinner with me." "At the diner," she said. "At my place," he said. "Saturday I'll cook. I've been practicing." She thought about the biscuits. She thought about the walk. She thought about the specific quality of this man's attention, which had never once in all the weeks she had known him made her feel like a problem to be managed or a phenomenon to be observed, but simply like a person worth knowing. "Saturday," she said. She cooked alongside him on Saturday, because she arrived, and he was in the middle of making a beef stew, and there were vegetables that needed cutting, and she simply started cutting them, and he rearranged the workspace to accommodate her without comment. They cooked together the way they had walked together, each person doing what needed doing without negotiation about who was supposed to do what. The dinner was good. The conversation was better. She stayed longer than she had planned, and when she finally said she should get back to town before dark, he saddled her horse for her, which she let him do not because she could not do it herself but because it was his stable and his gear and it was just a practical courtesy. He held the horse while she mounted, and then he looked up at her, one hand still light on the bridle, and said, "I'd like to keep doing this. Cooking together." She said because she wanted to hear him be direct. He was direct. "Seeing you," he said, "regularly and with intention." "I would like that too," she said, because she was done testing things she already knew to be true. She rode back to town in the long summer evening, the light going gold and then orange across the Texas flats, and she was smiling in a way that she would have been unlikely to explain to anyone who asked. The summer deepened, and the courtship, which was what it was, had the particular character of 2 people who both had too much work and too much sense to abandon their work for it. She surveyed, he ranched, and they found the time between those things and made it theirs. Sundays became a regular institution, sometimes at his ranch, sometimes riding out to see some part of the country she had not yet measured, sometimes simply sitting on her office porch in the early evening, watching the town go by and talking about whatever was on their minds. Redemption, Texas, which had had opinions about the female surveyor in the spring, began to revise those opinions by summer, partly because of the quality of her work, which was demonstrably excellent, and partly because of the particular social calculus of small towns in which a person vouched for by someone respected becomes gradually integrated into the community's sense of itself. Graham Malone was not the most prominent man in Redemption, but he was one of the most respected, in the specific way of people whose respect is earned by consistent honest dealing over time, and the fact that he clearly held Catherine Collins in high regard had a measurable effect on how the town regarded her. She was aware of this and was not certain how she felt about it. Her position should have stood on its own merits, and largely it did, but she was also honest enough with herself to acknowledge that social dynamics worked the way they worked, and that Graham's regard had made certain conversations easier than they would otherwise have been. She raised this with him one Sunday afternoon because she was not the kind of person who let things accumulate unexamined. "Does it bother you," he asked when she laid it out, "that it helped?" "Yes and no," she said. "It bothers me that I needed it. It doesn't bother me that you provided it because I don't think you were trying to do anything other than be yourself." "That's all I was doing," he agreed. "I wasn't running a campaign on your behalf. I was just not hiding that I thought you were exceptional." She looked at him. "You think I'm exceptional?" "I think you're one of the most capable and principled people I've met," he said, without any particular elaboration, in the voice of someone stating a fact. Catherine, who had spent her life fighting to have her capability acknowledged, and who had never quite gotten used to having it simply stated as obvious, felt the complicated emotion that came with being seen accurately by someone you cared for. "You're not bad yourself," she said, which was deeply understated, and they both knew it. In August, Harold Fitch asked her if she would consider a permanent position as county surveyor. The contract she had come on was for the 3 specific disputes, all of which were now fully resolved and recorded, and the formal engagement was technically complete. But the county was growing, the railroad was generating new boundary questions weekly, and the quality of her work had produced a reputation that was already bringing inquiries from neighboring counties. She sat with this question for 3 days before she spoke about it to anyone except herself. On the 4th day she told Graham about it over coffee on a Sunday morning, sitting at his kitchen table in the early light with her hands around a cup and her thoughts arranged into the clear columns she used when she was working through something important. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to know what you think before I tell you what I want," she said. He shook his head, slightly but clearly. "No," he said. "I want to know what you want first. Because what I think about it should be responsive to your actual preference, not the other way around." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to stay," she said. "The work here is interesting and growing, and I would be well positioned for it. I like this town. I have started to understand its land and its geography in the specific way that makes the work more meaningful." She paused. "And I want to stay because of you, but I don't want that to be the first reason or the only reason." "It sounds like it's one good reason among several solid ones," he said. "Yes," she said. "Then I think you should take the position," he said. "And I think you should do it because it's the right professional choice. And the fact that I'm here and I'm glad you're here is a good additional thing, but not the thing that determines the decision." She looked at him across the table, this man who had said "done" one evening on a town street, and had then proceeded to mean it, consistently and without asterisks, for months. "Graham," she said. "Catherine," he said. "I love you," she said, because she had been not quite saying it for approximately 6 weeks, and she had run out of reasons to continue not saying it. He looked at her with something so uncomplicated and complete in his expression that it required no particular interpretation. "I love you too," he said. "I've been not saying it because I didn't want to rush you. You are allowed to say things when they are true," she said. "I'll remember that," he said, and reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat there in the Sunday morning light with coffee going cold and the quiet sound of the Texas morning around them, and it was one of the best moments of Catherine Collins's life. She took the permanent position. She wrote to her mother, who wrote back a letter that began with concerns and ended with something that might have been cautious hope, and Catherine read the ending more than the beginning. Autumn came, and with it, the cooling of the air and the particular golden quality of Texas light in October, and the railroad's official arrival in Redemption with all the noise and disruption and economic transformation that entailed. New land claims were being filed daily. Catherine found herself busier than she had ever been in her professional life, which was saying a great deal. She hired a young man named Thomas Webb, fresh from a schooling in Austin, to assist her with the drafting work, and she trained him in her methods with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood what it meant to be trained by someone who took your development seriously. Graham's ranch did well that autumn. The creek dispute had been formally settled, the homestead filing on the 12 acres had been approved, and he had planted a fall crop that was coming in better than he had expected. She rode out on Sunday afternoons and watched the crops and felt something she had not previously associated with land that she was not professionally engaged with, which was a kind of personal investment in its prosperity. She was at his ranch on a Sunday in late October when he took her out to the east field, the 12 acres that had been legally his for 4 months now, and they stood at the edge of it in the cool afternoon air with the light coming in at a low golden angle. "I've been thinking about something," he said. She waited. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "but I want to ask you in a way that is actually a question and not an assumption." "Those are different things," she agreed. "I know what you want," he said. "You told me. An equal, not a wife in the specific way that word usually means, where someone else's life becomes the center and yours becomes the support of it. A partner. Someone whose life is alongside yours and not above it." "That's what I said," she confirmed, because it was. "So here is what I'm asking," he said. "Will you marry me with the understanding that your work is as important as mine, that your opinions carry as much weight as mine, that I will never ask you to stop doing what you do or be less than what you are, that we will make every significant decision together, and that I will spend the rest of my life being worth the trust you'd be putting in me?" Catherine Collins, who had surveyed hundreds of miles of Texas land, who had gone to court and won, who had trained a colleague and organized a county's records and resolved disputes that had been festering for years, stood in the October light in a field that would not have legally belonged to this man without her work, and felt the full specific weight of being loved by someone who understood her. "Yes," she said, with the same promise back. "That I will be worth your trust, that I will be your partner in everything this life brings, and that I will tell you when I disagree with you and listen when you have reason to disagree with me." He took her face in both hands and kissed her, there in the October field, and it was exactly right, warm and real and free of any of the performance that surrounded things that weren't quite what they appeared to be. They were married in November, in the Methodist church where they had attended that first social together, in a ceremony that was well attended because the town had come to regard them with the particular fondness of a community that feels it has witnessed something good. The pastor performed the ceremony, and Mrs. Annabel Torres sat in the 3rd row with her sons, and Harold Fitch sat in the 5th row looking like a man who was very glad he had not managed to send Catherine back to St. Louis on that first afternoon. Catherine wore a dress that was dark blue, not white, because she had never been the kind of person who did the expected thing when the expected thing was not also the right thing for her, and it suited her admirably. Graham wore his best suit and his second-best boots, which he had spent significant time polishing, and he stood at the front of the church with the calm, steady expression of someone who was exactly where he wanted to be. They said their vows, which were the standard words of the time and place, and Catherine had considered and then decided against altering them specifically, because the vows were not the complete picture of what they had promised each other, and the complete picture lived in all the conversations before and all the ones still to come. When it was done, Graham kissed his bride in a way that made several of the older women in the congregation smile in the particular way of people who recognize something true. The winter they spent together in the small house on Graham's ranch, which was now their ranch, was the kind of winter that could have been difficult. Two people with established habits and independent natures learning to share close space in the months when the weather kept everything close. But it was not difficult in the ways that Catherine had feared it might be, because the things that could have been points of friction were not points of friction with this particular person. She kept her surveying work, riding out when the weather permitted and doing drafting and report work at the desk they set up in the second bedroom when it did not. He never once suggested, even by implication, that dinner timing or laundry or any other domestic task should necessarily take precedence over her work. They divided what needed doing in the house with the same practical logic they applied to everything, based on who was better positioned to do a thing at a given time, and not on any preset assumption about whose responsibility it was. There were disagreements. There would have been something wrong if there weren't. Once in February, they had a genuine argument about whether to take out a bank loan to expand the barn, she thinking the interest rates were unreasonable for what they would gain, and he thinking the expanded capacity would pay for itself inside 3 years. They argued it through properly, with facts and projections and raised voices at one point, and they came to a compromise that incorporated part of each position. He was partially right, and she was partially right, and they both knew it and moved on. That, she thought afterward, was what being treated as an equal actually felt like in practice. Not the absence of disagreement, but the presence of resolution that acknowledged both sides had standing. Spring came back to Redemption, and with it the anniversary of her arrival, and she sat on the porch of their ranch house one morning and looked at the land and thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a carpetbag and a satchel and had told Harold Fitch that she was here to do a job. She had done the job. She was still doing it. And she had done something else alongside it that she had not fully anticipated, found a home in a place and a person, both. Graham brought her coffee and sat beside her, and he followed her gaze out across the spring land, the fields coming green, the distant line of the creek catching the morning light. "You're thinking about something," he said. "Last year this morning I was on a stagecoach," she said. And now I'm here," she said. "Which is better?" He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the ease of someone who had learned over months exactly how to fit against this particular person, and they watched the morning come up over the land they were building together. In the summer of 1879, Catherine discovered she was expecting a child. She received this information from the doctor in town with the practical calm she brought to most things, and then sat alone in her office for a while, letting herself feel it without immediately categorizing it into tasks and preparations. It was surprising and it was enormous, and it was, she found when she sat with it honestly, welcome in a way she had not been entirely certain it would be. She told Graham that evening. He was very still for a moment, the particular stillness of someone receiving information of great magnitude, and then he said, "Are you all right?" Which was, she thought, exactly the right first question. "I'm fine," she said. "Tired. The doctor says that's normal." "What do you want to do about your work?" he asked. "Continue it for as long as I'm physically able to," she said, "and return to it after. This isn't going to stop being who I am." "I know that," he said. "I just wanted to make sure we talked about it." "What do you feel about it?" she asked, because she also wanted to know. He looked at her with that complete, uncomplicated expression she had come to trust completely. "I feel like I'm the luckiest man in the state of Texas," he said. She laughed, which she did more easily and more often than she had a year ago. "That is extremely sentimental for a man who presents himself as practical." "I contain multitudes," he said gravely, and she laughed again. The pregnancy was not easy in every regard. The summer heat was formidable, and there were weeks in August when she felt she was moving through warm water rather than air. But she continued her survey work through October, making necessary adjustments to what she could reasonably access and what required her assistant Thomas to handle directly. Graham was attentive without being anxious, which was the particular balance that was most useful. He brought her things she needed without being asked, sat up with her on the nights when sleep was difficult, and never once treated her condition as something that made her less capable of making decisions about her own life. The baby came in January of 1880, in the cold of a Texas winter that was harsher than the previous one, in the front bedroom of the ranch house with the doctor and Mrs. Torres, who had become a genuine friend over the course of the year, in attendance. It was a boy. Graham, who had been in the hall because the doctor had very particular opinions about these arrangements, was allowed in afterward, and he came to the bed where Catherine was holding their son, and he looked at them both with an expression that she thought she might spend the rest of her life remembering. "He's healthy," the doctor confirmed, gathering his bag. "He is loudly announcing that fact," Catherine said, which was true. Graham sat on the edge of the bed and she shifted so he could see the baby better, and for a while they were simply two people looking at a new person, the particular odd silence that does not require commentary. "What do you want to name him?" Graham asked. "James," she said, "after my father." He did not suggest alternatives or have a different preference he needed to assert. "James Malone," he said quietly. "Good name." James Malone grew in the manner of babies everywhere, rapidly and with constant demands and the particular gift of being entirely worth it. Catherine returned to her survey work in the spring, initially part-time, with Mrs. Torres' eldest daughter, a capable 17-year-old named Rosa, coming to the ranch several days a week to watch James. This arrangement worked well and continued to work well as summer came on, and Catherine's work schedule returned to something approaching its previous pace. James's first year was a full one for redemption as well. The railroad brought commerce and new settlers and new disputes, and Catherine's office became the central reference point for a significant portion of the county's land transactions. She expanded her team, adding a second assistant, and negotiated with Harold Fitch for a proper office space in the new county building rather than the rooms above the land registry. Harold Fitch negotiated with the resigned pragmatism of a man who had long since accepted the situation and found it, against his initial expectations, to be entirely workable. The county surveyor's office was well organized, efficient, and had a reputation across 3 counties for the accuracy of its maps and the quality of its court testimony. The county commissioner, when pressed on the matter at a public meeting by a man from one of the newer settler families who had some thoughts about women in official positions, said simply that he had looked at the office's record and he would not change it, which ended the matter. Graham handled it the way he handled most things that came from outside their lives, with a steady equanimity that Catherine found both admirable and occasionally amusing. He was not a man who was easily disturbed by the general nonsense of the world, and he had the specific gift of knowing when to engage with something and when to let it pass. He was, by this point in their marriage, so thoroughly her partner that she sometimes thought about the woman she had been a few years ago, the one who had given that careful speech about what she would require, and felt something tender toward her. That woman had known what she needed. This life was what she had been describing, without quite knowing what it would look like fully realized. When James was 2 years old and beginning to demonstrate a personality that included an extremely strong preference for being outdoors at all times, Catherine discovered she was expecting again. This time she received the information with somewhat more immediate equanimity, having navigated the first experience and knowing better what to expect. "Another one," she told Graham, in the kitchen, on a March morning while James was attempting to convince the barn cat to come inside. Graham looked up from the harness he was mending. He smiled, the same uncomplicated, genuine smile she had first seen in her office above the land registry. "Good," he said. "You might wait until you know what's coming before you commit to good," she said. "Good regardless," he said. The second child, born in the late autumn of 1882, was a girl. They named her Alina, after a woman in a novel Catherine had loved since she was 12, a choice that Graham found entirely reasonable and made no comment on beyond asking how to spell it. Alina was different from James in the specific ways that children asserted their individuality from very early on. Where James was outdoors-oriented and steady-natured like his father, Alina was watchful and precise, and had, by the time she was old enough to sit on Catherine's lap at the surveying desk, a noticeable interest in the maps. She would point at them with considerable authority for a child of 2, as though she understood that they were pictures of something real. Catherine showed her what they were pictures of. Graham built them in the spring of 1883, an addition to the ranch house, a proper second bedroom for the children, and a larger front room, because the house that had been the right size for 1 person, and then adequate for 2, and then crowded for 4, had reached the point where expansion was practical rather than indulgent. He did much of the work himself, with the carpentry skills that had been evident in the original house, and their neighbor Peters and his 2 sons helped with the framing over 3 weekends. Catherine held boards when she was needed and made coffee, and kept James from participating in ways that were either dangerous or counterproductive, and she watched Graham work and felt, as she often did watching him, the particular contentment of having chosen well. Redemption grew and changed through the early 1880s, as the railroad continued to do what railroads did to western towns. New families arrived and needed their land surveyed. Old families expanded their claims and needed those expansions documented. A new school was established, which pleased Catherine enormously, and she served on its founding committee and argued successfully for a curriculum that included practical mathematics and basic land science for all students regardless of sex. Mrs. Torr's son Raphael married a young woman from a family that had come in with the railroad, and the Torr's family celebrated with a dinner to which the Malones were invited, and at which Graham's beef stew, considerably refined from its first appearance years ago, was received with universal approval. There were hard years mixed in with the good ones, because the West did not tend toward unbroken ease. A drought in 1884 hurt the crops significantly and required careful management of their resources. Catherine's survey income was steady regardless of weather, which proved to be a more meaningful buffer than either of them had quite articulated when they were first building their finances together. Graham saw this clearly and said so, giving her credit for the fact that her work had made the difference between a difficult year and a genuinely desperate one. She noted the acknowledgement and appreciated it not because she needed the validation, but because it meant he was paying attention to the shape of their partnership and recognized it accurately. James started school at 6, marching in on the first day with the absolute seriousness of someone taking on a significant responsibility, and reported afterward that the teacher was very clear, which from James was high praise. Alina would follow 2 years later and would become, within a term, the student who always had more questions than the lesson plan had accounted for, which Catherine heard about with a private smile of recognition. They had been married 7 years in the autumn of 1885 when Catherine, looking at the new county maps she had spent 3 months producing, the most comprehensive survey documentation the county had yet possessed, thought about how different the world was from the one she had surveyed in her head before she arrived. She had come here with a plan that included her work and her independence, and a very specific set of requirements for anything else. The plan had been good. The actual life was better than the plan, not because the plan had been wrong, but because it had left room for things she had not known to put in it. A particular man, particular children, a particular piece of Texas ground that had become, in a way that surprised her every time she thought about it, home. She was in her office on a Tuesday morning when Graham appeared at the door, which was unusual at midday. He was holding James, who was 8 and considerably larger than he had been, but who appeared to have acquired a dramatic head wound that was already resolving into a substantial bruise. "He fell out of the oak tree," Graham said. "James Richard Malone," Catherine said, rising. "I almost made it to the 3rd branch," James said, with the dignity of someone whose defense was that the attempt had been impressive even if the outcome was not. "Sit down," Catherine said, examining the bruise with efficient hands. "You're not badly hurt. You are going to have a considerable headache." "It was worth it," James said. "You are extremely like your father," Catherine said. Graham, behind James, made a face that suggested he was divided between being pleased by this and feeling it was prudent not to be too obviously pleased by it at this particular moment. She pressed a cool cloth to the bruise and told James to sit quietly for an hour, which he did with the focused patience of someone who understood that negotiating this particular rule was not going to go well, and she went back to her maps and Graham sat in the spare chair, and they were quiet together in the easy way of people who had long since learned that silence between them was not empty. "The Hendricks claim came through," Graham said after a while. "I know. I processed it last week. They're going to want a full survey. I have them scheduled for the first week of October." He looked at her with the expression that was one of her favorite things about his face, the one that meant he was admiring something and not bothering to hide it. "You have it all accounted for," he said. "I generally do," she said. "That's one of approximately 40 things I love about you," he said. James, cloth over his eye, said from his chair, "You two are very embarrassing." "You'll understand when you're older," Graham told him. "I doubt that," James said with complete sincerity. Alina came home from the neighbor girl's house that afternoon and examined her brother's bruise with the focused assessment of a child who had watched her mother examine things carefully and had absorbed the method if not yet the full application of it. She announced that he was fine, which was the same assessment Catherine had reached hours earlier, and went to wash her hands before supper. Supper was beans and cornbread and the remnants of a roast chicken, and James recovered enough to eat more than his share, and Alina told them at length about the neighbor girl's new kitten in a level of detail that suggested she was building a case for something. And Graham listened to all of it with the full attention he had always given to things that mattered, and the lamplight was warm on the table, and the Texas evening was coming down blue and wide outside the windows. Catherine looked at all of it, at the table and the people around it, at her husband and her children, and the life that had been built here through years of work and honesty, and the particular accumulation of daily choices made by people who were trying to do things right. She had come to Redemption, Texas, in 1878 with a carpetbag and a satchel, and a set of requirements so specific they had seemed to most people who heard them like a way of ensuring she would never have to meet them. A man who treated her as an equal. Done, he had said. Done turned out to be a beginning, not an ending. Done turned out to mean every day for 7 years and counting. Done in the morning and done in the evening. Done in the difficult winters and the prosperous summers. Done when she was right and done when she was wrong, and done in every ordinary hour that was the actual substance of a life. She picked up the cornbread and passed it to James, who took it without ceremony, and Alina was asking about the kitten again with renewed strategic intensity, and Graham caught her eye across the table, and the look between them was the language of people who have spent enough time together to communicate complete thoughts without requiring words for all of them. She had built her life on the principle that she would be no one's lesser. She had found, against her careful expectations, someone who not only agreed with that principle but lived it, who had never once made her smaller to make himself seem larger, who had stood beside her and not in front of her, and not behind her but beside her, which was exactly the geometry she had required. The stars came out over Redemption, Texas, the same extravagant sky she had first seen walking home from a church social with a man she was just beginning to trust. James finished his supper and went to stand at the window to look at them, because he had recently become interested in the stars the way children became interested in things, totally and immediately. Alina joined him a minute later, and they stood at the window in the lamplight with the dark sky enormous beyond them. "There are so many," Alina said. "More than you can count," James told her, with the authority of an older brother. "Catherine," Graham said quietly just to her. "I know," she said just back, Outside the window, the Texas night held its stars. Inside, a lamp burned on a table where a family sat in the particular warmth of an ordinary evening, which is what extraordinary lives are made of when you look at them closely enough. The surveys she had completed hung framed in the county office, the Voss Malone Creek boundary, the Greer easement that had protected 4 families, the comprehensive county map of 1885 that would be the reference document for decisions made in this county for decades to come. Her name was on all of them, Catherine Collins Malone, county surveyor, documented in her own precise hand. She had done the work she came to do. She had built the life she required. She had loved and been loved by a man who had said done, and had meant it in every moment since, who had never once asked her to be less than herself, who had made a family with her that bore the marks of both of them, practical and honest and full of the specific warmth of people who chose each other every day. The children came back to the table for the dried apple slices she had put out, James still talking about the stars and Alina with the focused expression of a child who was not done with the kitten question, but was willing to table it temporarily. Graham poured the last of the coffee and set the cup in front of her the way he always did, small habitual kindness, the kind that made up the texture of years. She picked up her cup. She looked at her life. It was exactly what she had said she wanted, and it was more than she had known to ask for, and both of those things were true at once, which was perhaps the best thing that could be said of any life. Outside, the stars burned over Texas. Inside, Catherine Collins Malone was home.